Jeff Paur, senior writer for RealTime Fantasy Sports, and welcome to another edition of the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. On today's show, I'm going to give you my 5 fantasy takeaways from Week 6 of the fantasy football season. It was certainly an interesting week of games. It was a little top-heavy in terms of fantasy production. There was just a few players that had huge games, and for the most part, a lot of the players that produced were players that were likely on your bench. This caused for a lot of low-scoring fantasy games unless you had players like Derrick Henry on your team who went off and produced huge numbers in his matchup. Henry had just a monster game. But for the most part, it was a little bit of a low-scoring week across the NFL. There are still two games left and some top fantasy players in those games, so maybe the scoring will pick up as those games get played tonight. All right, but I'm going to give you my 5 fantasy takeaways for the games that have been played in Week 6. My first fantasy takeaway: it is time to unleash Deandre Swift. Yes, Lions, please do this right now. We saw his potential in this last week. 14 carries for 116 yards, 2 touchdowns, 8.3 yards per carry. He looked explosive, made a lot of plays after contact, made plays before contact as well, had great moves in space. He can catch the ball. Adrian Peterson, he's been a great pro, but he's just a ho-hum player at this stage of the game. Why are they still giving him so much work? I don't know. It's time to unleash Deandre Swift. Peterson this past week, he had more carries than Swift, 15 carries, but he ran for just 40 yards, averaging 2.7 yards per carry. I think Swift definitely deserves more work, especially with the Lions struggling as a team. Why not give the rookie the most chances running the ball? He definitely showed his huge upside in this game. Hopefully this is the case going forward, getting more work. He could be a huge fantasy asset the rest of the way. My number 2 takeaway: the Bucs are for real. Took a little time for them to get going, but they are producing. And the main reason for me that I think they're for real is because of their defense. This defense is an elite fantasy defense right now. They've allowed 20 or fewer points 4 or 5 games. They get after it rushing the passer. They also have a very good secondary, some great young cornerbacks. This defense is really, really good. And I think it's almost a plug and play at this point for fantasy teams. And also the rest of the teams coming around. Tom Brady, multiple scores, 3 or 4 games, 11 touchdowns to just 1 interception his last 4 games. Ronald Jones, 3 straight 100-yard games. He is the running back in this offense. He's getting it done on a weekly basis. Leonard Fournette has been banged up. He's not around. Jones is getting the job done. Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, I know they've been banged up, haven't been elite all year, but they are elite receivers. Hopefully they keep getting healthy, keep getting more targets. They can be big-time fantasy producers. And then lastly, Rob Gronkowski had his best game of the season this past week. 5 catches for 78 yards and a touchdown. He's been getting a little more work of late. Maybe he's rounding in form a little bit in this offense. So this Bucs team really impresses me right now. I think they're a legit Super Bowl contender. A lot of good fantasy pieces as well. My number 3 fantasy takeaway for Week 6 is Baker Mayfield will Baker Mayfield. He scored about 9 fantasy points this past game against the Steelers, a huge division matchup to show maybe they're for real. They got blown out in this game. Mayfield was terrible. 10 of 18 for 119 yards and a touchdown with 2 interceptions. He was eventually pulled in the game. He's been battling a rib injury, so that had something to do with it, but also the team was down big. Mayfield does have multiple touchdowns, all but 2 games, but his fantasy numbers have not been good. He has fewer than 20 fantasy points all but a game. So despite scoring those touchdowns, he's not scoring many fantasy points. I don't think he's worth using it at all for fantasy teams. Let's hope the Browns stick with a run-heavy approach offensively, limiting Mayfield. I think that's when he's at his best. All right, my 4th fantasy takeaway: if you need a defense, pick the team playing the Jets. They have top 20 points just once all year. They got shut out this past week against the Dolphins, who do not have a great defense. Their running game is terrible. Frank Gore is not getting it done as the starter with Le'Veon Bell gone. Joe Flacco, Sam Darnold, that combo hasn't been very good as well. They lack a lot of options at the receiver spot, so their passing game's limited. It's just not a very good offensive team at all. So if you need a defense, if you're going with a streaming approach, target the Jets on a weekly basis. If that defense that's playing them is out there, go grab them. My last takeaway for this week is Ryan Tannehill is a top 10 fantasy quarterback. The numbers don't lie, folks. This Tannehill is getting it done on a weekly basis. 2 straight 30-plus fantasy point games. He was 30 of 41 for 364 yards and 4 touchdowns with an interception. His last game against the Texans, that great, thrilling come-from-behind victory for Tennessee. It was a great game for Tannehill once again. He has at least 21 fantasy points, all but a game. 14 total touchdowns to just 2 interceptions on the season. Tannehill is doing it on a weekly basis. He is an elite fantasy quarterback. The numbers don't lie. He did it the second half of last year. A lot of people were worried about their possible run-heavy approach this year with Tannehill starting from day one, but that has not been the case. Tannehill gets his chances. He produces. He should be in your lineup if you have him on your team. All right, those are my 5 fantasy takeaways from week 6. Hopefully you had success this week, produced big with your fantasy lineups, and came away with victories. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports. Have a great day.